Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a really fascinating collision of ancient biblical history and 20th century Korean history. We're going to look at themes of oppression, sudden freedom, and the heavy responsibilities that come right along with it. It's honestly a wild look at how human nature just echoes across thousands of years. Let's dive in. So set the stage for all this, we gotta look at Sima Quen. He's widely considered the ancient Eastern father of history, and he prompts us to ask a really foundational question. When does a nation's true history actually begin? According to him, it doesn't start with ancient myths or early ancestors. Nope, it begins when actual sovereignty and governance kick off. So let's take that modern lens and apply it to two very distinct groups of people. Here's the roadmap for our explainer today. We're gonna cover 1. The birth of a nation and Passover. 2. The forgotten feast and two kings. 3. The Japanese occupation and Exodus. 4. The 1945 liberation and first worship. And finally, number 5, the meaning of true liberation and repentance. All right, let's jump straight into section 1, the birth of a nation and Passover. So if we apply Sima Qian's rule to ancient Israel, we actually find something pretty surprising. Their true history didn't begin with their famous ancestors, guys like Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. Instead, their genesis as a sovereign people was the Exodus from Egypt. It's exactly like the 4th of July or August 15th. This was their actual Independence Day. It was the literal moment they went from being enslaved subjects to a distinct independent nation. And this perfectly sets up the core concept we need to grasp today. See, the Exodus was sparked by the Passover, which is totally different from your standard historical revolution. The Passover wasn't some grand military victory. It wasn't about enslaved people using tactical brilliance to violently overthrow their oppressors. Not at all. It was actually a confession that they were spared by pure, unearned grace. The angel of death passed over their homes simply because of the blood of a lamb on their doorposts. It wasn't because they were morally better or physically stronger than the Egyptians. It was just this profound act of divine intervention. Which brings us to our second section, the Forgotten Feast, Two Kings. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. We see this massive contrast between two leaders, King Hezekiah and his great-grandson, King Josiah. On side A, you've got Hezekiah. He was driven by the sudden burst of human zeal, so he rushed to reinstate the feast. But he actually held it a whole month late. And what happened? The tradition completely faded out within a single generation. But then look at side B, Josiah. His approach was totally different. It was driven by deep, agonizing repentance after he rediscovered the lost book of the law. He made absolutely sure the exact proper date was kept. And the result? Josiah's tradition survived entire empires and is still unbroken 2,600 years later. Crazy, right? To really understand why Josiah's precise observance endured for so long, we can actually look at a modern parallel. Over in Korea, there was this intense, nearly century-long government effort to completely ban the traditional Lunar New Year, trying to force a Western solar calendar on everyone. But you know what? The people just quietly kept celebrating it anyway, until the government finally threw in the towel in 1989. The takeaway here is that when a foundational truth is rooted in real identity and true repentance, it becomes completely unerasable. And just like that, Josiah's precise Passover survived Babylon, Rome, and literally centuries of exile. Let's fast forward to the 20th century. For section 3, Japanese occupation and Exodus. There's a deeply chilling and honestly kind of ironic detail from this really dark era. As the Japanese Empire tightened its grip, they heavily censored Korean churches. But do you know what their number one target was? They strictly forbade any sermons mentioning the biblical Exodus. Just think about that for a second. A massive, mighty 20th century empire was absolutely terrified of an ancient story about slaves finding freedom. For the oppressors, the very narrative of liberation was just way too dangerous to allow. Because of this, believers faced immense, agonizing pressure to hold on to their identity. Just to be allowed to hold a church service, the occupying forces forced them to perform these idolatrous rituals. Before a pastor could preach a single word, the entire congregation had to bow to the east toward the emperor, recite a pledge of loyalty, physically bow to a Shinto shrine placed right inside the church, and shout banzai 3 times. Only after going through all that crushing forced submission were they actually allowed to begin their Christian worship. It was just a brutal time of spiritual and physical compromise just to survive the day. But as we know, oppression rarely lasts forever. That brings us to section 4, 1945, liberation and first worship.
On August 15, 1945, the Japanese Empire surrendered, and sudden, staggering liberation came to the Korean peninsula. And look at this timeline. Just 4 days later, on August 19th, Korean Christians gathered for their very first Sunday service in a newly freed nation. I mean, you can only imagine the sheer emotion in those rooms. People were finally preaching and singing in their native language for the first time in years, completely free of those oppressive rituals they had been forced into.
Yet history tells us something truly unexpected about that day. You'd probably think the primary emotion would be pure, unadulterated celebration, right? Kind of like Hezekiah's joyous but fleeting festival we talked about earlier. But no. The pastors, many of whom had literally just been released from prison for refusing to bow to the shrines, led their congregations in profound weeping and repenting. Instead of throwing a massive party, they spent their very first moments of freedom actively repenting for compromising their beliefs out of fear.
And that perfectly sets up our final takeaway in Section 5, meaning of true liberation and repentance.
So in both ancient Israel and 1945 Korea, we're seeing the exact same profound realization taking place. Remember King Josiah? When he found the book of the law, he literally tore his clothes in repentance before he ever celebrated the Passover. And the Korean Christians in 1945 did the exact same thing. They repented before they truly celebrated their newfound liberation. Both of these groups recognized a crucial truth. Lasting liberation has to be rooted in an acknowledgement of unearned grace, not just human excitement or some boastful sense of triumph. They knew they didn't free themselves. They were freed by grace, and that required absolute humility. To really cement this idea, we can look at a brilliant parallel straight from the ancient text. The Passover itself is, historically speaking, just a one-day event. But it is immediately followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which lasts for 7 whole days. Eating this unleavened bread for a week symbolizes a continuous, lived-out commitment. It's a powerful reminder that the gratitude of liberation isn't just a fleeting one-day party. It has to become an entire lifestyle. Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought drawn directly from our explainer today. The source puts it like this: the joy of liberation takes one day, but living out its true meaning takes a lifetime. Whether we're looking at ancient history, the massive geopolitical shifts of 1945, or even our own personal lives, sudden freedom is thrilling, but it's really just the beginning. The real question you have to ask yourself is, how will you live out the true meaning of the freedoms you've been granted? Think on that. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and we will see you next time.